Good morning, my name is Pastor John, and today is Wednesday, May 27th, and I'm really excited to get into the book of Daniel, chapter 8 today. Going to be looking at some more visions, the vision of the ram and the goat. This chapter really correlates to Daniel chapter 7. These two chapters really cover the same events, as well as, really relates to Daniel chapter 2 also. But before we get into it, what I've really loved about this study is really just seeing how how the visions that God has given Daniel really correlate to history. A lot of times whenever we think of visions in the Bible, we think of prophecy and all these things, we kind of jump towards end time stuff, and there's some end time stuff that we've been talking about a little bit, but at least in Daniel chapter 8, we really see things that are going to be happening between, the 5th and 2nd century, and even up to, Jesus' time. But a lot of times whenever we think about the book of Revelation, when we think of, God's going to come in and he's going to destroy the nations, and there's going to be a new heaven, new earth, and it's all just kind of these big concepts, and we don't exactly know what it's going to look like. We don't exactly know because it hasn't actually happened yet, and there's some vaguity of the things that are in the book of Revelation. Sometimes I just sit down and read Revelation. I'm just like, I don't know what's happening. I don't understand it, and that's the way that a lot of us are. We're not sure, and I think it's partially done on purpose, that God leaves some mystery to the future. He gives us assurance that Christ is coming back, that we can trust that God is going to be victorious in the end, but we still have some vaguity in that. We still have to live through this life. We have to continue to persevere through the things. And going back to Daniel chapter 8, what I love is that we can actually say, okay, Daniel was, prophesying for his time period, and he was looking towards the future, and that future today has already happened, and we can actually say, okay, Daniel said this, and then this happened, and then Daniel said that, and then this happened, and it's just been really cool to really dive into the history aspect of it. I'm kind of one of those people that get really how would I put it? Revelation hasn't been my biggest kind of draw. It hasn't been the thing that excites me the most about the Bible. I love reading about Jesus. I love reading about the things that he's done for us. But Revelation, future events, that hasn't always been my biggest interest. But this is really cool to me because we can actually see it correlating together. And another thing that's really interesting, and I think it brings the question of how do we know to trust prophecy? There's still a lot of skepticism today. Is prophecy for today, or has it been, or has the spiritual gifts kind of gone away? Is God still prophesying? And I think in a general sense, God can still use prophecy for us. I think today it happens more on an individual level than a global aspect of prophecy. I think God can call someone into ministry, say, hey, you're going to be doing ministry for me. God calling someone to be a pastor. He is foretelling, hey, you are going to be a pastor. He's telling about future events. Or, there's prophecies on missions, there's prophecies on family and all these things, and I think there is some validity to it. We can trust that God still teaches us things through visions, through his word, but I think the biggest thing is we have to test everything. So whenever I hear of someone prophesying, I go into it with a healthy amount of skepticism. Is this truly coming from God? Is this actually true? And I think the biggest test for someone who is prophecy, or for prophecy in general, is, does it actually come true? Does what the prophet is saying actually happen? And what's amazing about Daniel chapter 8 is we see that the things Daniel was foretelling actually come into being. The Medo-Persian Empire does come in to destroy Babylon. The Greeks do come in and destroy the Medo-Persian Empire. There is a direct correlation, and that proves the word of Daniel. And that's a big thing for us today, is if someone is out there prophesying and they even speak one wrong prophecy, I would go so far to, not only does it discredit the prophecy, but it discredits everything that they have ever said. And this goes back to the Bible too, is if something that is written in the book of Daniel becomes untrue, it not only kind of means that chapter, if Daniel chapter 8 was proven false, not only is Daniel chapter 8 completely false, but I would go so far to say the whole book of Daniel would be false, and even possibly the book of the whole Bible would become false as well. And that puts a lot of weight, but I also, that is how much I trust the Bible and how much I think the Bible is credible to what is written, what is true. And the fact that these things have proven to be true just gives more credit here. So diving into Daniel chapter 8, we see once again Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 are just so closely related. They cover the same period, they cover the same nations, but they kind of attack it from different perspectives. Each chapter has an animal representing a nation. Each vision just kind of paints this wider picture and gives us a more clear understanding of what is to come. And that once again just proves the urgency. The things that are being spoken of here have been spoken in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and now Daniel chapter 8. So whenever God is repeating a message, that means that there is an urgency for us to listen, because what he is saying is important. We need to hear what God is speaking to us. This goes without the same thing happens throughout the whole Bible. When God repeats a message, when God is repeating something, that means, hey, tune our ears and listen, because this is important. This is going to happen. This is going to directly impact our lives. So in Daniel chapter 7, we see that God's kingdom is under attack. There's ruthless earthly rulers attempting to seize world dominion. There's this religious and political battle going on, and it's just raging on. There is the authority of God is challenged. There is human traditions just substituting biblical truth. There's earthly authorities that are claiming to be ultimately deity, that have the authority above all. And there's just all these things just happening. And then we get Daniel chapter 8, where God makes his final move to set all things right. We see God really taking charge here. We see truth that has been kind of cast to the ground. They've discarded truth, but it is being restored. In earnest, heartfelt prayer, God's people are confessing their sins. They're coming to God. They are repenting of what they've done. They are repenting of their rebellion against God's purposes. And what's amazing is when God's people repent and truly seek after God, God is going to forgive them. God's grace is going to cover them. He's going to transform them by his love and renew them with his power. And whenever we see kneeling before his heavenly throne, we see people seeking him. We see people truly surrendering everything to the God above, to the God of all. And there's this call of God's final judgment that really inspires God's people to a deeper commitment, a deeper spiritual experience to what is happening. And there's this kind of focus of eternity in view, that God is in control, that God's going to be in control for all eternity, that there's an eternity awaiting for us in heaven, and that there's this kind of final appeal that comes from the very throne of God in heaven, and that God is most sacred, God is in control. And whenever we see, and also that there's this final judgment for those who stand against God, of course. And in each of these chapters, chapters 7 and 8, Daniel receives visions of just all these different nations coming together and all these things that are happening. So I want to dive into Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 through 8. And it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ula canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward, northward, and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of this canal. And he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns, and the ram had no power to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. So now we see in Daniel, there's this shift from Daniel, the first 7 chapters of Daniel, to now Daniel chapter 8 to the end of the book. And this shift really includes that the first part of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic, and then beginning in chapter 8 verse 1, Daniel switches to Hebrew through the rest of the book. And what this really does is it switches the focus to God's people, where the first 7 chapters of the book of Daniel really focus on the Babylonian people. It's from the kind of more of a Babylonian perspective, Nebuchadnezzar receiving the visions and seeing his kingdom falling down and what's going to come after. Now we're going to see the perspective of the Jewish people, the Jewish people having to go through all these times of slavery and being enslaved to all these nations after nations after nations. And especially in Daniel chapter 8, we're going to see the kind of persecution that comes to the Jews, that they're going to be suffering through all these evil and wicked rulers who are coming against God. So the vision in Daniel chapter 8 is kind of predicting the events that involve these second and third world empires. And this time that's going to be spanned through the visions of chapter 8 really stretch from the 6th to the 2nd century BC. So we look in verse 1, and verse 1 opens that we are in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar. So once again, the vision comes before the events of chapter 5. And Belshazzar has become co-ruler at this time with Nabonidus, and they became rulers in 553 BC. And that kind of means that it really places Daniel around 70 years old at this point. So Daniel is, progressed in age. He has been around a while, and God kind of finally brings him this vision. And I think it's kind of telling that Daniel is receiving this in his old age as God's kind of saying, hey, here are the final things that are to be done. Here is kind of your final effort in the world, in a sense. And that's just kind of how I take it. I don't know if that's really true. But jumping down to verse 3, we see that just like in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel sees animals representing the world's nations. Daniel sees a ram with 2 horns representing the Medo-Persian Empire. The 2 horns represent the 2 nations, and one of the horns is longer than the other. The longer horn comes up last, and this signifies the dominant states of the Persian Empire, despite the fact that it was originally the weaker empire. So what this means is the Medo-Persian Empire is really 2 nations coming together to rule coherently. And originally the Medes were the more powerful, stronger force within the Medo-Persian Empire, but over time the Persians really took over to where, whenever I think of the Medo-Persian Empire, I just almost call it the Persian Empire. That's just kind of in my head. We all have heard of the Persians, but we don't always know about the Medes exactly. They kind of, even though they're originally more dominant, they kind of become the second nation, the second class nation in a sense. So once again, I'm going to have a picture on this video just kind of showing the what each animal represents and comparing the 3 chapters that we've talked about, Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and Daniel chapter 8. So moving on to Daniel chapter 8, verses 4 through 5, we see Daniel sees a male goat charging to the west, to the north, and to the south. And this goat represents the Greek Empire. And the goat has 2 conspicuous horns between the eyes. And looking forward to verse 21, we see that this horn represents the first king. And I'm sorry, we have, instead of 2 conspicuous horns, there's actually 1 conspicuous horn. I misread that. But we have looking to verse 21, so I want to read that. So 8:21, which says, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. So this really represents Alexander the Great, one of the greatest Greek kings and rulers of all time. And it says that this goat crossed the surface of the earth so rapidly that its feet did not even touch the ground. And this really represents Alexander the Great's speedy conquest. I mean, we know Alexander just went in and he just conquered. And we know that he conquered the entire East in only 3 years. Such an amazing kind of an amazing conquest, and it almost happened out of nowhere, really. I mean, he just started and he did not stop. Nothing was standing in his way. Jumping down to verse 7, we see that the goat struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns. This refers to the Greek Empire's crushing defeat of the Medo-Persian Empire in 331 BC. When it came to Greece, the Medo-Persian Empire just didn't stand a chance. It just came in like a force, crushing it swiftly, and that kind of was the end, is the passing of the torch. The Greeks were now in power. Chapter 8, verse 8 says, although the male goat had become very great at the height of his power, the large horn was shattered. So I want to read verse 8 once again. And it says, then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. So although this, Alexander the Great had such this might and such this power, it ultimately was shattered. And this really refers to Alexander had this really sudden death. He wasn't conquered. He wasn't overthrown. He became sick in 323 BC and died. And Alexander died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, interestingly, in Babylon. So he's in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar and he gets sick. And we kind of think that most likely he got sick of typhoid fever, and that's kind of the disease that was really attacking that area at that time. So with Alexander's sudden death, remember, this wasn't planned. There wasn't like this succession plan. It's kind of like, if you're let's kind of take it, if you're a kind of a CEO of a company or an owner of a company and you suddenly die, there's not always a succession plan to take up. And this especially is true with nations. So what happens is the Greek nation begins to kind of split apart into 4 smaller nations. So it was divided by his four of his generals. So we see that Cassander was over the Macedonian and Greece areas of the empire. Lysimachus was over Thrace and Asia Minor. Seleucus was over Syria and Babylon, and Ptolemy was over the Egyptian area. And that was another thing, that Egypt was destroyed as well. And this really describes the 4 conspicuous horns that replaced him at the end of chapter 8, verse 8. So now I want to read the chapter 8, verses 9 through 14, which says, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. It grew great even in the hosts of heavens, and some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became very great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over to it, together with the regular burnt offerings, because of transgressions. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking from another holy one, said to the one who spoke, for how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering and transgression that makes desolate, and giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. So here's this conflict between power and great power. So between the power of man, what can man accomplish versus the full strength of God. So looking at the first three verses here, verses 9 through 12. So as opposed to the little horn that will come out of the fourth kingdom in Rome, described in Daniel chapter 7 verse 8, we see a different little horn emerge out of one of the four kingdoms that divided the Greek Empire. And this little horn is presumed to be Antiochus IV, who reigned from 175 BC to 163 BC. And Antiochus really was this kind of ruling, conquering, kind of evil, just really oppressive king towards the Jewish people. And he was the ruler of the Seleucid dynasty, and he during his time he conquered the surrounding areas to the south and to the east. And once again, he especially dominated the people of Israel. He brutally trampled and persecuted the Jewish people from 170 to 164 BC. So we see for 6 or 7 years, he was just ruling and domineering. And Antiochus really was a true blasphemer. He presented himself as the Prince of Hosts, claiming to be God himself. He personified the god of Zeus. He said that he was the human representation of Zeus himself. Daniel 8:25 says he will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. So Prince of Princes is what he is called. And while oppressing Israel, he put an end to he really goes into Jerusalem and he put an end to daily sacrifices in the temple. I mean, just imagine you are the Jewish people and this Greek king comes in and says you are no longer allowed to offer sacrifices to God. And he essentially ended the temple's use as a means to give glory to God. And this is where his blaspheminess really comes in. So following the rebellion in Jerusalem in 169 to 168 BC, Antiochus ended up removing the high priest whose name was Jason, and he placed a man named Menelaus in as high priest, who was not a descendant of Aaron or the tribe of Levi. And he's in this time he just slaughtered thousands of the Jewish people. So just imagine you have the high priest, the priest that was head of the temple in Jerusalem, who is appointed by God. And not only did he go in and kill the original high priest, but he put in another guy who would do his bidding, who was not even of the tribe of Levi. So this is very serious here. And once Antiochus departed from here, he heard of this second rebellion that had really broken out. And after this second rebellion, he outlawed Judaism. So Judaism was no longer allowed to be practiced. And among the now forbidden practices was the rite of circumcision. So Jews could no longer become circumcised. They could no longer offer sacrifices in the temple, and they could no longer simply practice Judaism. And the study of the Torah was outlawed, and keeping of the kashrut, the Jewish dietary laws. So they were kind of banned from their entire religion, essentially. And kind of the worst thing that I really think comes about this is in the Jewish Holy Temple, he kind of goes and he steals all the relics, he steals all the precious gold and jewels in the temple, and he places in it a statue of Zeus, the god he believed that he himself was a manifestation in his own royal being. He believed he was Zeus incarnate, and he put Zeus in the temple of God in Jerusalem, and he offered sacrifices of pigs on the altar, which was completely detestable. I mean, this was a complete disgrace, and once again, he's just stripped the temple of all the sacred vessels. So now jumping into verses 13 through 14, I just want to read that again. It says, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one, he said to the one who spoke, "For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offerings, the transgression that makes desolate, and giving over of the sanctuary of hosts to be trampled underfoot. And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be destroyed to its rightful state. So in verse 13, we see evidence that God is going to limit the triumph for evil. And this is kind of one of the hardest things for us as Christians, and I think us as just human beings to really wrap our minds around, is why does God allow evil to triumph? So Daniel hears what he presumes to be two angels speaking to one another about what is taking place. And what's interesting is the angel doesn't ask why these things are happening to Israel. And I think the reason he doesn't ask why is he understood why. Israel is in their position because they disobeyed God. Israel is being subject to this because they were not following God the way that he called them to. This is a punishment for their actions. They did not follow his ways, and they sought after other gods. They abandoned the true God of the world, the God who held everything into existence. And because they went after other gods, God let those false gods try to protect them, and they couldn't. The angel also knew that this wasn't going to happen forever, and that's why he asked the question: how long is this going to take place? How long is Antiochus going to kind of dominate and rule over Jerusalem and desecrate the temple of God? How long will Antiochus continue his evil work over Jerusalem? And God has a lot of ways of using evil for ultimate good, for correction, especially when it comes to judging or disciplining his people. And we see that he often uses evil here, and it's unfortunate, but it's as simple as if God's people would have followed him, this never would have happened. But we also must realize that though while we live in this life of evil, and evil will prevail at times, there is a limit to the power of evil. God does limit the authority that rulers and evil rulers have on this earth, and ultimately God's will prevail. So in verse 14, we see Antiochus' defilement will only last 2,300 evenings and mornings. So this is roughly 2,300 days, and it comes to about 6.3 years. So Antiochus' rule and dominion is going to last 6.3 years. And this lasted until the temple was rededicated by Judas Maccabees in 165 BC. So let's kind of set up this timeline real quick. So in 175 BC, Antiochus issued the decree that forbid the Jews from all of their religious practices. So in 167 BC, this kind of coincides directly with the 6.3 years, Judas Maccabees, a Jewish priest, with the help of his sons, led a revolt against the Jewish oppressors, or the Greek oppressors. And they eventually cleanse the temple of the false idols and rededicate the temple back to God. And this victory is still remembered today and is celebrated by the Jewish people, and it's the festival of Hanukkah. So the holiday of Hanukkah represents the revolt and taking back of the temple by Judas Maccabees. And all of these things are recorded in the Apocrypha, kind of the intertestamental period if you want to go check that out. So now jumping into Daniel chapter 8, verses 15 through 27. So we see that beginning in verse 15, it says, "When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened, and fell on my face. But he said to me, Understand, O son of man, that the visions is for the end, or the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end. And latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is a king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken in place, of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall rise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall rise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men, and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. So Daniel receives the interpretation of the vision of everything that he sees. What's amazing is you receive this vision and it can become unclear. Like, why, we have this ram and this goat and they're attacking one another. Like, what does this all mean? And what appears before Daniel is Gabriel, the angel. So Gabriel, along with Michael, are the only angels who are actually mentioned by name in Scripture. Gabriel will also give the message of Daniel's 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 through 27. He also announces the birth of John the Baptist in Luke chapter 1, verse 19. And most importantly, Gabriel also foretells the birth of Jesus to Mary in Luke chapter 1, verse 26. So jumping down to Daniel chapter 8, verse 17, Gabriel addresses Daniel as the Son of Man. And this really is speaking to the humanity of Daniel. Daniel falls face down in reverence to the heavenly beings who is speaking to him. It says in verse 18 that he falls into a deep sleep. This could be seen as some kind of trance, possibly. Either way, it's really just a sleep state. It is kind of putting Daniel into a position that he was going to be able to take in more, I guess. I'm not really exactly sure what it means. But either way, Daniel is taking in the interpretation of the vision. That's kind of the gist of this message here. Excuse me. So Gabriel tells Daniel that all that he is seeing refers to the time of the end, that this is all future times, all looking towards the end times. So this is kind of strange because the events that occur in this vision are between the 6th and 2nd century BC. But what really connects this vision to the end is this deliberate placing of the 2 horns and 2 horns from the vision of chapter 7, and that both chapters, in chapter 7 and 8, there are little horns represented. So here in chapter 8, the little horn refers to Antiochus, where the little horn in chapter 7 refers to the end time Antichrist. So what I think this really kind of shows here is that Antiochus is kind of the representation of what type of evil the Antichrist will have in the end. That the Antichrist will look very similar to what Antiochus looked in the time of Greece overpowering Jerusalem. So jumping down to verses 23 through 25, I'm going to read that once again. It says, "And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressions have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall rise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. without warning. He shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. So Gabriel now expands on his description of Antiochus, that he would take the throne through deceit against the rightful heir. So what we know about Antiochus is that his nephew Demetrius was actually the rightful heir of the throne. So following the death of his brother Seleucus, Antiochus traveled from Athens all the way through Asia Minor to reach Syria, and he got there around November of 175 BC. So Seleucus' legitimate heir, Demetrius the first, Soter, was still in hostage in Rome. So Demetrius was the proper next in line ruler to become the ruler of Greece, but he was held hostage in Rome. So Antiochus seized the throne for himself, proclaiming him the co-regent with the son of Seleucus. And the son of Seleucus, who Seleucus had died, had an infant named Antiochus as well. And Antiochus murdered the infant son and just pretty much took the throne by force. And this all happened in 170 BC. So Antiochus did not belong to the throne, but he took it by force. He, through evil such as murder and deceit. But Antiochus' power would not be his own, but would have kind of this satanic source to it. He would succeed at first, defeating many powerful rulers and generals and destroying many of God's holy people of Israel. But this kind of initial success would all come to the end. He would then deceive himself, thinking that he was a great god. We know that he believed that he was the manifestation of Zeus himself, and he got it in his head that he was even great enough to oppose the one true God of the world. And in the end, he would ultimately be shattered, not through assassination or battle, but through some ailment that is sent by God. So he ultimately is killed by sickness, not by war or capture or anything like that, or assassination. So Daniel chapter 8 verse 26 says, "The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now." So Gabriel calls Daniel to seal up the vision, and this isn't to hide the vision, but at this time it didn't really have any immediate implication. Remember, this is several centuries down the line when this is all going to happen. So at this time, it was the 3rd year of Belshazzar. The temple was actually still destroyed, so the Jewish temple wasn't even rebuilt. The second temple wouldn't come until much later, when Ezra and Nehemiah come along. So this means that Daniel's vision was of the destruction of a temple that wasn't even built yet, and it didn't have any immediate implications for the people of that day. So Gabriel told Daniel to seal it until a time that it would become relevant information. So as we kind of come to the end of this chapter, I just kind of want to summarize everything that happened here. So Daniel chapter 8 completes this symbolic presentation of the future that's contained in the book. So the dream image of chapter 2 and the 4 wild beasts of chapter 7 are both parallel, but span the time from the Babylonian kingdom to the establishment of God's kingdom. And this is symbolized by the stone that became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And this all concludes with the kingship of the one like the Son of Man, who is Jesus. Now chapter 8 presents only 2 animals, this time from the flock. And here is the Babylonian kingdom. Here the Babylonian kingdom is kind of disregarded as if it's already been destroyed. And there's no mention of the kingdom of God here. So Daniel chapter 8 really kind of focuses in on a smaller time period than Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7 had. So instead, there is this kind of greater interest in what is taking place with Antiochus and what happens when kind of atheism or paganism is taken to its logical conclusion. That being, Antiochus ends up making himself out to be the manifestation of God himself. That is really this idea that if there is no God, then I am God in my own life, and I'm going to make myself out to be God. And I'm going to make myself out to be God, even to challenge the authority of the one true God. That means my beliefs, my understanding of the world is going to trump the reality and what God has put into place. So as we come to a close, what I find amazing is that the visions that are spoken work directly with history. We can trace it and we can see where God's prophecies that are received by the prophets are being fulfilled. We can gain assurance in the things that God has said. And I think there's a great assurance in that if God's prophecies that have been given in the past have already become fulfilled, that means the prophecies that haven't become fulfilled yet, we can trust that they're going to be. God's prophecies have stood the test of time, and we can continue to trust in them. So I just want to close in prayer today, and I encourage you to continue to dive into this. Unfortunately, you can't really get everything that's happening here in a short amount of time. You could continue to study more and more and more, and this is really just kind of an introduction to what is happening. So let me pray. Dear Lord, I just want to thank you for today. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to come and look over Daniel chapter 8 today. God, I pray that you just bless us with its information and continue to help us grow closer to you. In Jesus' name, amen. I pray for you all, and I hope that you have a good rest of your week. So we'll see you next time.